Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and we're going to talk about books today. I read a lot of fiction. Um, I've done a video previously on the channel called Favorite Witch Novels. I will probably do a follow-up to that at some point where I talk about a few more witch novels that I have discovered since I recorded that video that I also quite enjoy. Today, I wanted to talk about novels, not about witchcraft in general, but novels that are specifically about traditional Wicca. By traditional Wicca here, I mean like Gardnerian and Alexandrian style, initiatory, lineaged, coven-based Wicca. And there are a handful of books that have been written about it or inspired by it. Uh, None of them are very good. There's a reason that none of them made my list of favorite witch novels. Uh, Pagan literature, by and large, is not good literature. So all of the books that I'm going to discuss here today, I'm going to speak critically about. You know, I read them, I enjoyed reading them because it's kind of fun to read a book about people who are doing something roughly in the domain of what I do. But none of these are like favorite books of mine or books that I go back to and reread over and over again. These are books that are noteworthy for their subject matter rather than for the quality of the writing and the plotting and the literary themes that they contain. Um, Now, that's also, like, I don't mean to be disrespectful to the people who have written these books. A couple of them are elders of the craft. A person may be a wonderful ritualist and an important figure in craft history, and nonetheless have written a novel that I don't enjoy. Your tastes may be different, so I'm not trying to shit all over these people. Just saying that as I'm discussing these books, I'm not necessarily recommending them unless you're really on the hunt for a novel that's about traditional Wicca, because if you're just looking for a good book about witches to read, there are other things that I would recommend sooner. That said, let's dive in. The first book that we are going to discuss is, of course, High Magic's Aid by Gerald Gardner. I thought I had a copy of this, but I can't find it on my shelf, so maybe it's somewhere behind me, or maybe I lent it to someone and never got it back. Who knows? High Magic's Aid is a terrible novel, but it presents, I think, a really interesting picture of what Gerald Gardner imagined witches in the past to have been like, and how he imagined that witches would have functioned, both relative to more sort of Key of Solomon style ceremonial magicians, and then more broadly in the context of like witch persecutions, and when the witch cult went underground as it was supposed to have done, what would that have looked like? So the novel follows a pair of brothers, Jan and Thor, who require magical assistance and seek out a witch. And they go on this quest to find a witch to help them consecrate magical tools in order to, I don't even really remember, something about like saving their kingdom. Um, Eventually they get initiated into the witch cult, and one of them says, yes, this is absolutely for me. I have found my homecoming. I want to go further with it. And the other one says, gosh, that was stupid. I'm done. I'm out. Peace, guys. And doesn't go any further with Wicca. So I think broadly speaking, the novel is maybe worth reading just if you want to get a sense of like how Gerald Gardner imagined witches would have operated in the past, and particularly during a time of witch persecutions. It has some interesting things to say about like the way that witches connect to other forms of magic, like the evocation of demons. It has some interesting things to say about how he thought that the whole secrecy thing would have worked in a time when being a witch was very dangerous. But as a piece of literature, it doesn't really stand up. The second book that we're going to talk is also set in the past, and that is Witches Were for Hanging by Patricia Crowther. This book is again set during the time of witch persecutions. There is a coven of witches who are put in danger when the Witchfinder General arrives in their town. And there's a woman who escapes from the Witchfinder General. The witches take her in. She ends up falling in love with one of the witches in a very sort of sapphic lesbian way. Um, and eventually ends up getting initiated into the witch cult herself. This book has some really graphic depictions of sexual violence, and those depictions are actually quite highly eroticized. For that reason, I found it a very difficult and kind of unpleasant book to read, just because it's so graphic. Um, but if you can stomach that, if you can make it past that, again, I think the interesting thing about this book is how it portrays what Patricia Crowther imagines witchcraft might have been like in the early modern period, and how she imagines covens might have functioned. So, for example, there's a great deal of discussion about like witches shape-shifting and going to their sabbats in the form of animals. And Patricia Crowther addresses this by saying everyone is wearing an animal mask as they make their way to the sabbat, so that no one who sees them will be able to identify them. I guess she thinks that peasants in the early modern period were particularly credulous because they see someone dressed in a wolf mask and they think it's an actual wolf, but anyway. So she talks about some things like that. She talks about like the idea of the man in black, and there's a big revelation at one point in the book that the man in black is actually the high priestess of the coven, and this is the great secret of the witch cult, is that covens are led by women and not by men, and that's why no one can ever find the leader of the coven, because the Witchfinder General is always looking for men. So again, just sort of interesting as a piece of historical imagination as we're thinking about how craft elders are imagining that the craft might have looked in the distant past. We're now going to fast forward out of the past and into sort of contemporary present day. And we're going to talk about the Bast novels by Rosemary Edghill. I have 3 of them set together in a single volume called Bell, Book, and Murder. This is a series of murder mysteries where the protagonist is a Wiccan high priestess. The first one is called Speak Daggers to Her, the second is called Book of Moons, and the third is called The Bowl of Night. And in every case, these are novels that are set in the New York occult scene in the late 20th century. The protagonist is a Gardnerian priestess, and she is solving murders. And she uses a little bit of magic. She, meets with her coven. The other characters are all recognizable members of the occult scene, some of whom are like pretty clearly parodies of real people. So if you're familiar with what the occult scene was like in New York in like the 80s, a lot of this will look familiar to you. And it's pretty entertaining. It's pretty fun. There's not a whole lot of ritual in these, so this book is interesting because of the way that you sort of get to see Wiccan characters in a recognizable contemporary setting navigating their everyday lives and then encountering sort of a book plot or something like that. But there are no fantastical elements to it. They're not fantasy books. They're just murder mystery books where the characters happen to be pagan. And that's kind of interesting and fun to engage with. Yeah, I think that's about all I have to say on that front. There's not a great deal of ritual or magic in these books. The ritual and magic really sort of take a background. They're set dressing, so a lot of the time it'll be like, the main character, Bast, goes over to her coven for ritual, and then we cut to after the ritual. So there's no discussion of like what circle would look like or how magic would be done, that sort of thing. There's maybe a little bit of it, but not a ton. The final 2 books that I have to discuss today are both science fiction books. So they're both taking Wicca and setting it not in an imagined past or in the contemporary real world, but rather in a speculative future, and thinking about how Wicca might interact with a future world. The first of these books was written in the 1960s, so the future world here is by now in the past. But it's called The Sign of the Labrys by Margaret St. Clair. In researching this book, Margaret St. Clair was inspired by having read Witchcraft Today, and she actually reached out to Gerald Gardner to do research for the book, and he put her in contact with Rosemary and Raymond Buckland, who gave her feedback on the manuscript for this book and sort of helped her figure out what she wanted to do. The premise of this book is that most of humanity has been wiped out by a plague, People are now living in caves, hiding from each other. One of the effects of this plague is that it has broken down human social contact. People can't stand to be near each other. And there's a man who is living in this post-apocalyptic wasteland who gets sucked into a conspiracy, and he ends up descending sort of down the levels of this cave, all the way down to the very, very bottom of the cave, where he meets a Wiccan high priestess who initiates him into the cult of witchcraft, and together they use witchcraft to try to sort of heal humanity of the after effects of this plague, and to try to sort of bring humanity into a new age following the apocalypse that has wiped out most of humankind. It's a strange book. It's very bizarre and surreal and dreamlike. It has sort of this dungeon crawler vibe to it, where he goes down level by level, descending into the cave, and each level is almost an entirely different world. So there's one level where he finds the level of the cave where all those really rich people retreated to. And it's this technological paradise, and everyone is drugged out and not even really aware that there has been an apocalypse. And then, there are other levels where, there's an entire ocean down under the cave. And so it's a very strange book, and you kind of just have to be willing to, roll with it. But it's also, one of those weirdly influential books that, the influence lasts, but the memory of the book does not. So the structure of the narrative in this book, descending through layers of a dungeon, was actually an explicit inspiration for the dungeon crawling structure of early Dungeons and Dragons games. So when D&D was being created, the creators of the game took inspiration from this book in modeling how the game would work. Which is just sort of a fun and interesting fact. On the whole, I think this book has some of the hallmarks of science fiction in the 1960s that make it really dated and not as interesting to a contemporary reader, right? You have to really like 1960s sci-fi, which is a very particular genre of its own, in order to get on board with this book. And otherwise, it's kind of just, I don't know. Maybe I was too sober when I read this book. Anyway, the final book that I'm going to discuss today is Omega by Stewart Farrar. I hate this book. It's just, again, like I said, none of these books I really consider great works of literature. This is the longest of these books, and so it's a slog. It's a slog. The basic premise of it is that scientists discover a new way to generate electricity, something, 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 poles of the Earth's magnetic field, drawing on sort of a pseudoscientific version of the idea of magical polarity that was very important to Stewart Farrar, particularly at the time that he was writing. And the scientists who discover this new source of energy do it in a way that destabilizes the Earth and ends up unleashing disastrous ecological side effects. And so the result is earthquakes all across the world, and there's this weird dust that comes up out of the cracks in the earth that makes people basically into zombies, and there's just it's a kind of strange science fiction setup. But then the governments of the world, realizing what they've done but not wanting to take accountability for it, decide to blame Wiccans and sort of tell the public that Wicca is responsible for causing all of these apocalyptic effects because Wiccans are Satan worshippers. And so a new round of witch hunts is unleashed, and witch persecutions come out again as the pagan population is used as a scapegoat to cover up the environmental crimes of the world governments. Not gonna lie, I didn't finish this one. I tried. I really, really tried. I made it halfway through. It's so long, and again, I'm not trying to crap all over these people, because I haven't written a novel. It's a difficult thing to do. It's a more difficult thing to do well. But this novel was not to my taste, and I did not find myself able to finish it. Nonetheless, I think, again, as with any of these books, the thing that's interesting about them to me is not so much the book itself, but what the book says about how the author was thinking about how Wicca would fit into an imagined past, or the contemporary real world, or an imagined scientific future. And here we see a really strong concern with ecology that Stewart Farrar has. So we have this idea that like Wicca and the health of the earth, the health of the environment, are intertwined in a really important way. We also see a deep, deep worry about the future persecution of witches, about the idea that witch hunts could come back. And I think those are thematically the two main things that I pull out of this book that make it interesting to me. In terms of like, these are the things that I think Stewart Farrar was trying to explore, and these are clearly the things that mattered to him when he was writing this book, and he was using fiction as a way of trying to express that. So those are my 5 books, 5 novels about traditional Wicca. Of them, in terms of like what I enjoy most just simply as a book, probably The Sign of the Labrys. It's a very strange book, but I can sort of like, you know, I can put myself in a 1960s sci-fi pulp mentality and enjoy reading this. But I don't know, all of them are books that I got something out of having read. I think they gave me interesting perspectives just on like what these other people were thinking about Wicca when they gave voice to it through fiction. So I hope you enjoyed this book, this video. If you think of a novel that is about traditional sort of initiatory, lineaged, coven-based Wicca that I haven't mentioned here, feel free to drop it in the comments. There's a possibility that I've read it and I just forgot to put it on my list for this video, or there's a possibility that I don't know about it, in which case here is a delightful opportunity for me to read something new. Thank you so much for your time, and I will see you sometime soon. Bye.